3 hours after I walked out of a place I wasn't supposed to survive, my phone lit up with a message from my mother. No questions, no relief, no hesitation, just one sentence typed the way she always spoke to me when she wanted something to disappear. "You're just a mistake of my past I want to forget." I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering my heart, strangely calm. I had spent 9 years learning how to breathe without permission, how to wait without hope, how to keep my face still when everything inside me screamed. That message hurt more than the locked doors and the clipped voices and the paperwork that turned my name into a number. Because it told me the truth I had been circling my whole life. The truth that my captivity hadn't shocked her. It had solved a problem. I typed one sentence back. I didn't add punctuation. I didn't soften it. I didn't explain. "Consider it your last wish." The phone started buzzing immediately. Unknown numbers, missed calls, alerts I didn't recognize, a voicemail from someone who introduced himself as a lawyer, another from a woman who spoke like she was reading from a script and asked me to confirm my location. I turned the phone face down and watched it vibrate against the table the way a trapped insect flutters before it's noticed. You probably think this story begins with that message. It doesn't. That text was only the moment everything finally caught up. To understand why one sentence could cause that kind of panic, you have to understand how long I had been disappearing before anyone bothered to notice. I had been learning to be forgotten since I was a child. I grew up in a house that looked perfect from the street, white siding, trim hedges, a porch my mother insisted stay clear of clutter because clutter suggested weakness. Inside, everything had a place, including people. My mother believed order was a form of love, and she loved control more than anything. She liked to say she raised me to be independent, but what she meant was quiet. My earliest memories aren't of being yelled at or hit. They're of being corrected. Adjust your tone. Fix your face. Don't make that noise. Don't ask so many questions. Don't make it about you. I learned early that attention was something you earned by being useful, and usefulness was defined by how well I fit into her story of herself. My father was present in the way a piece of furniture is present. Solid, unmoving, uninvolved. He worked, he ate, he slept, and he let my mother handle the rest. When I looked to him for backup, he looked past me as if acknowledging my discomfort would complicate his evening. So I stopped asking. Children are good at adapting. We learn the rules even when no one writes them down. The first time I understood that my mother saw me as a problem was small enough that I ignored it. I was 19 and had come home late from work, exhausted and shaking from a day that had gone wrong in a dozen quiet ways. I told her I thought I needed help. Not money, not advice, just help. She sighed, checked the clock, and said, "You always choose the worst timing." It wasn't anger. It was annoyance. As if I had spilled something on a clean floor. After that, things shifted. She began asking questions that felt different. Not curious, but precise. She wanted to know what I planned to do next year, what documents I had, who I spoke to. She asked about stress and sleep and whether I ever felt overwhelmed. When I answered honestly, she nodded like she was collecting data. When I tried to joke it off, she frowned like I was being evasive. There were names she never mentioned around me, places she avoided. A relative she dismissed as irrelevant, even though his photograph sat face down in a drawer she kept locked. I learned about him by accident overhearing a phone call she thought I couldn't hear. The way her voice changed when she said my name, and his in the same sentence made my stomach drop. Something had been set aside for me. Not a gift, not an inheritance in the way people imagine money changing hands. It was authority, access, the kind of thing that doesn't look valuable until someone tries to take it from you. And my mother couldn't touch it. That fact haunted her. That was when she brought him into our lives. He arrived with a smile that never reached his eyes and a voice that sounded reassuring because it was practiced. He said he handled complicated situations. He said families like ours needed guidance. He asked me how I felt, and when I answered, he tilted his head as if listening for a diagnosis. My mother watched him the way she watched mirrors. The rules changed without announcement. Appointments appeared on the calendar I wasn't allowed to control. Conversations happened behind doors that used to be open. When I objected, I was told I was being sensitive. When I insisted, I was told I was proving their point. The day I stopped existing was ordinary. That's what still unsettles me. I ate breakfast. I tied my shoes. My mother said we had an important meeting and asked me not to make a scene. The room we walked into wasn't set up for discussion. People spoke about me as if I weren't there, using words like concern and best interest and temporary measures. When I refused to sign what they slid across the table, they nodded satisfied. Refusal, they explained, indicated instability. By the time I understood what had happened, my phone was gone, and my name no longer belonged to me. What followed wasn't violence. It was patience, a clean place, quiet routines, smiles that never promised anything, days without dates, weeks without explanations. I waited for someone to notice, for my mother to appear and say this had gone too far. She didn't. Her silence told me everything I needed to know. Years passed. I learned how systems get lazy when they think they've won. I learned how to watch without being seen. I learned how to wait. So when I finally walked out, when the doors I wasn't supposed to open opened anyway, I didn't run. I planned. And when my mother finally spoke to me again, when she reduced my life to a sentence she thought would erase me, I understood something she never did. She had mistaken silence for surrender. She thought forgetting me meant I was powerless. I didn't disappear overnight. That's the lie people like to tell themselves, because it's easier to believe tragedy arrives suddenly than to admit it rehearses for years. Long before anyone signed a document or locked a door, I was already being edited out of my own family. Slowly, carefully, in ways that looked harmless if you weren't the one living inside them. Our house was quiet in the way museums are quiet. Everything polished, everything intentional, nothing out of place. My mother liked it that way. She believed noise led to mess, and mess led to judgment. She ran our home the way she ran her life, with appearances first and feelings last. There were no rules written on the walls, but I learned them early. Don't interrupt. Don't contradict. Don't cry unless you can explain it neatly. If something hurts, make sure it's justified before you mention it. And above all, don't embarrass her. Embarrassment to my mother was the unforgivable sin. Affection in our house wasn't given. It was earned, and it could be revoked without warning. If I did well in school, she praised me in front of other people, her hand light on my shoulder, her smile wide and practiced. Later in private, she'd remind me not to get arrogant. If I struggled, she sighed as if I had inconvenienced her personally. "I just don't know why you make things so difficult." She'd say, not unkindly, but not kindly either. I became very good at shrinking. My father was there, technically. He ate dinner with us most nights. He nodded along when my mother spoke. He didn't challenge her, and he didn't defend me. I don't think he meant to abandon me. I think he chose the easier path, and that path required silence. When I looked to him for reassurance, he looked at his plate. When arguments happened, he disappeared into the garage. He wasn't cruel. He was absent in the ways that matter most. My mother noticed everything, every change in tone, every shift in mood, every mistake, but she only intervened when it affected her. If I was sad quietly, she ignored it. If my sadness threatened to spill into her schedule or her image, she shut it down. The first time I realized I was disposable wasn't dramatic. It was almost laughably small. I had come home late from work, exhausted and shaken. Nothing catastrophic had happened. Just a long day where everything went wrong in small, cumulative ways. I sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug I didn't remember pouring, and told her I thought I might need help. Not therapy, not money, help. The kind that comes from being seen. She didn't look at me. She checked the time and said, "You always choose the worst timing." That was it. No follow-up, no concern. Just irritation, as if I'd spilled something on the counter she'd just cleaned. I apologized. The reflex was automatic. After that, something changed. She began paying closer attention to me, but not in a way that felt caring. It felt like inventory. She asked about my plans, my future, my finances. She asked whether I ever felt overwhelmed, whether I slept well, whether I had trouble focusing. The questions came dressed as concern, but they were too specific, too methodical. When I asked why she wanted to know, she smiled and said, "I worry about you." But her eyes stayed sharp, watchful, like she was waiting for me to slip. There were parts of our family history she never discussed with me. A relative she dismissed whenever his name came up. A business matter she waved away as irrelevant. I once found a photograph tucked into a drawer she kept locked. The man in the picture looked nothing like her, but something about his posture felt familiar. When I asked who it was, she snatched the photo away and told me not to snoop. I laughed it off at the time. I didn't understand why her reaction unsettled me so deeply. To the outside world, we were enviable. People told me how lucky I was to have such a strong mother, how put together she was, how much she'd sacrificed. They praised her discipline, her standards, her devotion. I smiled and nodded and let them believe it because correcting them would have made me look ungrateful. At family gatherings, she told stories about me that framed her as the hero. I was always the difficult one. She'd guided the sensitive one. She'd managed the child who would have struggled without her steady hand. People laughed. They admired her patience. No one noticed how quiet I stayed. There were moments, fleeting and sharp, when I sensed something was wrong. Decisions made without me. Conversations that stopped when I entered the room. Papers moved from places I knew to places I couldn't access. When I asked about them, she told me I worried too much, that stress made people imagine problems. I started doubting my own instincts. That's the most dangerous thing someone can do to you. Once you stop trusting yourself, you become easy to steer. One evening as we sat in the living room, she mentioned me in the past tense. It was subtle. She said, when she was younger, even though I was sitting right there. I corrected her, laughing, assuming it was a slip. She waved it off, annoyed, and changed the subject. That night, I lay awake thinking about that phrasing. It felt like a test, like she was practicing something she planned to say later. I began noticing how often she spoke about me as a responsibility rather than a person. How she framed my needs as burdens. How she praised me most when I asked for nothing at all. I told myself it was normal, that all parents got tired, that I was being dramatic. Looking back, I can see the pattern clearly. Families don't suddenly decide to betray you. They justify it to themselves in advance. They create a version of you that makes their actions feel necessary, even compassionate. By the time I sensed real danger, it was already too late to step away quietly. I had become something my mother didn't want but couldn't ignore. Not a daughter exactly. Something else. Something that complicated her plans. There's a particular kind of fear that settles in when you realize the people who should protect you are the ones measuring you for removal. It doesn't scream. It whispers. It tells you to stay calm, to behave, to not provoke anything you don't yet understand. I tried to be smaller, quieter, easier. I stopped sharing my thoughts. I stopped asking questions. I watched. I listened. I told myself that as long as I didn't give her a reason, everything would stay manageable. That was my mistake. The truth is, reasons are only necessary when someone is undecided. My mother had already made up her mind. All she needed was a process. By the time I realized that my value in this family had shifted from emotional to transactional, the groundwork was laid. The conversations, the records, the narrative. I was no longer being raised or guided or even tolerated. I was being redefined. And once that happens, once a family decides who you are allowed to be, your consent stops mattering. I didn't know it then, but this was the last phase of my life where I still believed love might change her mind. The last time I thought being good would be enough. The last time I mistook silence for safety. What came next didn't start with violence or shouting or chaos. It started with a meeting. A calm voice, a request framed as concern, and by the end of it, I would no longer exist in any way that could protect me. Neglect by itself doesn't ruin a life, it just makes it smaller. What destroys you is the moment neglect turns into calculation. I didn't notice it right away. At first, it felt like a subtle improvement. My mother asked how I was doing more often. She remembered details she'd ignored before. She invited me to sit with her instead of dismissing me with a wave of her hand. If I hadn't lived my whole life watching her measure people for usefulness, I might have mistaken it for care. But it wasn't warmth, it was focus. She started asking about my plans with an intensity that made me uneasy. Not vague questions about dreams or hopes, but specifics. Where I planned to live, whether I'd signed anything related to my future, who handled my paperwork, whether I trusted anyone outside the family. Her questions came in clusters delivered casually, but always circling the same point. I felt like I was being mapped. One afternoon, she asked me if I'd ever thought about stepping back from things for a while. She phrased it gently, like a suggestion meant to help me breathe. When I asked what she meant, she smiled and said, "You've always been sensitive. I just want to make sure you're protected." Protected from what she didn't say. There were names she avoided around me, conversations that stopped the second I entered the room. Once passing her study, I overheard her speaking sharply into the phone, my name and another name tangled together in a sentence that made her voice shake. When I asked her about it later, she snapped at me for eavesdropping and told me it was nothing that concerned me. That was when I started noticing the gaps. There was someone in our family orbit she never mentioned unless forced to. A relative distant but influential whose presence she dismissed as irrelevant whenever it came up. I learned about him in fragments. A signature on an old document. A photograph tucked into a folder she kept locked. A lawyer's name that made her jaw tighten. The connection to me was direct. That much I could tell. And whatever that connection represented, my mother didn't control it. The first time I tested that theory, it was by accident. I mentioned the name casually pretending ignorance. The reaction was instant. Her face went still, her voice sharpened. She asked why I was bringing it up and what I thought I knew. The room felt smaller, tighter, like the air had been pulled out. That wasn't anger, it was fear. I didn't push. I nodded, apologized, changed the subject. But something inside me shifted. For the first time, I understood that my presence in her life wasn't just inconvenient. It was destabilizing. I wasn't simply unwanted, I was unpredictable. After that, the rules changed without announcement. She began limiting where I could go and who I could see. She said it was for my own good that I needed stability. She offered to handle certain things for me, paperwork and appointments, insisting it would be easier. When I hesitated, she accused me of being ungrateful, of not trusting her. I learned to comply while paying attention. The more she tightened her grip, the more she revealed what she was afraid of losing. I noticed how carefully she avoided certain legal topics, how quickly she shut down discussions that involved authority she couldn't touch, how often she framed my independence as a risk rather than a goal. One evening, a family friend stopped by unexpectedly. Someone professional, careful with words. He greeted me politely, then hesitated, as if deciding whether to say something. When my mother stepped out of the room, he leaned closer and said very quietly, "You should be cautious about who you rely on right now." Before I could ask what he meant, my mother returned, and the moment vanished. I told myself I was reading too much into it. I told myself adults said strange things sometimes. I told myself a lot of things that night. Looking back, that was a warning. Inside, I began changing in ways no one noticed. I stopped sharing details. I gave answers that were true, but incomplete. I learned how to sound calm even when I was frightened. I learned that silence could be armor if you wore it correctly. I stopped trying to be loved. I started trying to be underestimated. My mother mistook my compliance for surrender. She relaxed just enough to become sloppy. She let her guard down in small ways. She spoke more freely around me, assuming I wasn't listening. She began planning aloud, not details but intentions. There was something set aside for me. Not money in the way people imagine wealth, but leverage, authority. The kind of thing that doesn't glitter, but terrifies the people who want to own everything. As long as I existed as myself, that leverage stayed out of her reach. That was the problem she needed to solve. The day she introduced the man who would change everything, I understood it without being told. He walked into our house like he belonged there, confident and controlled. He shook my hand and held it just a second too long, his eyes scanning my face as if committing me to memory. He asked how I was feeling, how I was sleeping, whether I ever felt overwhelmed by responsibility. His voice was smooth, reassuring, professional. My mother watched him with something like relief. I answered carefully. Over the next few weeks, he appeared more often, sometimes unannounced. He spoke to my mother in private. He asked me questions framed as concern, but structured like assessments. He used words like stability and best interest, the same way people use locks they don't want you to notice. I felt the walls closing in not with force, but with paperwork and smiles. Still, I didn't fight. Fighting would have confirmed the story they were preparing to tell. I listened. I remembered. I filed away details the way some people file away savings hoping they'll matter later. By then, I understood something essential. My mother wasn't cruel for the sake of cruelty. She was methodical. She had decided who I was allowed to be, and anything outside that definition threatened her control. I was no longer her daughter in the way that mattered. I was a variable, an asset she couldn't manage, a risk she needed to neutralize. I didn't know when it would happen or how, but I knew with a clarity that chilled me that something irreversible was coming, and the most dangerous part was that everyone involved believed they were being reasonable. They weren't preparing to hurt me, they were preparing to erase me. That was the moment I stopped expecting rescue, the moment I accepted that whatever saved me would have to come from patience, not hope. Because once you understand you're being treated like an asset instead of a person, you realize something else just as important. Assets don't get loved, they get taken. Everything accelerated the moment he started coming to the house. Until then, the danger had been quiet, contained. It lived in sideways looks and unfinished sentences in documents moved just out of reach. I could still tell myself that if I stayed careful, if I didn't provoke anything, whatever my mother was planning would stall. I was wrong. She didn't bring him into our lives to advise her. She brought him in to authorize what she already wanted. The first time I met him, he smiled like he had practiced it in a mirror. Not wide, not warm, controlled. He dressed the way people do when they want to signal competence without inviting questions. His voice was calm, almost soothing, the kind that makes you want to trust it, simply because it never rises. He didn't introduce himself as a threat. He introduced himself as a solution. He shook my hand and asked how I was doing, really doing, and when I answered, he watched my face instead of listening to my words. It wasn't curiosity, it was assessment. I had the sudden, unsettling sense of being weighed. My mother hovered nearby, her posture different than usual, straighter, more deferential. She laughed at things he said that weren't jokes. She echoed his phrasing, his conclusions, as if aligning herself with him made her safer. In his presence, she stopped being the unquestioned authority in the room. She became an assistant. He asked me questions over tea, questions framed as concern. How was I sleeping? Did I ever feel overwhelmed? Had I noticed changes in my focus or memory? Each question was reasonable on its own. Together, they formed a pattern that made my skin prickle. When I answered plainly, he nodded thoughtfully. When I asked why he needed to know, he smiled and said, "It helps to understand the full picture." I didn't like the way he said picture. After that, he started appearing more often. Sometimes he'd call ahead, sometimes he wouldn't. He spoke to my mother in private, doors closed, voices low. When I entered the room, conversations stopped. Papers were turned over, screens went dark. I began to feel like a guest in my own home. The first time I pushed back was small. I questioned an appointment my mother had scheduled without asking me. She dismissed my concern and said he had recommended it. When I said I wanted more information, he stepped in smoothly, explaining it was just a precaution. That my resistance was understandable, but unnecessary. The word unnecessary stuck with me. There was a moment early on when I still believed clarity would help. I sat down with my mother and asked her directly what was going on. She looked tired, annoyed, like I was forcing her to manage something trivial. She told me she was worried about me, that I'd been under a lot of stress, that she just wanted to make sure I was taken care of. Her eyes slid toward the hallway, toward the room where he waited. I realized then that the decisions were no longer hers alone, and worse, she was relieved. The house changed after that, not visibly, subtly. My movements were noticed, my comings and goings commented on. If I was quiet, it was concern. If I spoke up, it was agitation. Either way, it was noted. He began speaking about me as if I weren't there, not rudely, clinically. She seems tense today. She might benefit from more structure. It's important we don't overwhelm her. Each sentence removed a little more of my agency. The first time I truly felt trapped was the day I tried to leave and was gently stopped. My mother stood in the doorway, her voice apologetic, telling me it wasn't a good idea right now, that we'd talk later, that I needed rest. He stood behind her silent, watching. I protested calmly. I explained. I reasoned. He nodded as if impressed by my composure and said, "That's exactly what we're concerned about." I didn't understand until later how carefully that line was chosen. After that, my objections were no longer treated as opinions. They were treated as evidence. He spoke about responsibility and risk and best interests, wrapping control in language that sounded ethical. He positioned himself as neutral objective necessary. My mother repeated his words like scripture. Everything was framed as care. Privacy eroded first. Doors opened without knocking. Conversations monitored. My phone checked under the pretense of concern. When I objected, my mother told me I was being defensive. He told me defensiveness was a sign of stress. There was always an explanation, always a justification. I began to realize that the goal wasn't to convince me. It was to document me, to create a version of me that could be managed on paper, regardless of who I actually was. The pattern became unmistakable. Questions designed to elicit doubt. Situations engineered to provoke a reaction. Then careful notes taken afterward. I felt like I was being baited, but the hooks were invisible. One afternoon, a neighbor stopped by unexpectedly. Someone my mother respected. Someone outside the circle he had built. She chatted in the living room while he stood off to the side, silent but attentive. At one point, the neighbor glanced at me and frowned just briefly. Later, as she left, she squeezed my hand and said softly, "Take care of yourself." The look in her eyes lingered with me. It wasn't pity. It was concern edged with suspicion. That night I lay awake listening to the house settle, realizing that concern from the outside was dangerous. It threatened the story being constructed. And stories like that require isolation to survive. I stopped arguing. I stopped explaining. I answered questions politely and vaguely. I smiled when expected. I made myself uninteresting. My compliance pleased them. He began to relax. My mother grew more confident. The conversations behind closed doors grew longer. Papers moved more freely. They thought the resistance had ended. In truth, I was memorizing everything. I learned his schedule, his habits, the way he phrased his notes. I learned when my mother felt most confident and when she deferred without thinking. I learned the language they used to justify what they were doing, because language is the skeleton of any system like this. The final warning came from someone unexpected, a professional involved briefly, carefully. They asked me a question that seemed innocuous but carried weight. "Do you feel you have choices right now?" I hesitated too long. Their eyes sharpened. Nothing came of it immediately, but the moment stayed with me. A reminder that not everyone was blind, that cracks existed even if I didn't yet know how to reach them. By then, I understood the truth I had been avoiding. My mother hadn't brought this man into our lives to help me. She brought him because she needed someone who could do what she couldn't do alone. She needed legitimacy. She needed distance. She needed a way to tell herself that whatever happened next was reasonable. What was coming wouldn't be discussed with me. It wouldn't be negotiated. It would be decided in rooms I wasn't invited into, written in language designed to make it sound inevitable. I didn't know the date. I didn't know the method. But I knew with a certainty that settled cold in my chest that the house I was standing in was no longer a home. It was a waiting room, and the people smiling at me had already agreed on what I was waiting for. The morning it happened felt so ordinary that I didn't mark it in any way. I woke up at the usual time. I made coffee. I stood at the kitchen sink watching steam rise from the mug while my mother read the paper like nothing in the world was about to change. If there had been shouting or tension, I might have noticed, but calm was her weapon. Calm made people compliant. She told me we had an important meeting later that morning. She said it lightly, like an errand. When I asked who would be there, she smiled and said, "People who want to help you." The way she emphasized help made my stomach tighten. I almost didn't go. That hesitation still haunts me. I remember standing in my room, hand on the doorknob, wondering if walking out would make things worse. I had spent months convincing myself that patience was safer than resistance. That logic followed me out the door. The building was nondescript, clean, professional, the kind of place where decisions are made quietly and no one raises their voice. We were ushered into a conference room that had been prepared in advance, water already poured, papers stacked neatly, chairs positioned so that I sat slightly apart from everyone else. That should have been my first warning. People introduced themselves quickly, their names sliding past me. They spoke to my mother more than to me. When they did address me, their tone was careful, almost gentle, the way you speak to someone you've already decided can't be trusted with the truth. They began by talking about concern, about stress, about patterns they had observed. They used phrases like recent behavior and emotional volatility. Each time I opened my mouth to respond, someone else rephrased what I said in a way that made it sound unstable. When I spoke calmly, they exchanged glances. When I became frustrated, they nodded as if I'd confirmed something. I realized with a slow, sickening clarity that this wasn't a conversation. It was a performance. And my role had been assigned before I ever walked in. They slid a document across the table and called it temporary. Protective. A measure designed to give me space to recover. The words were reassuring, almost kind. They said I could revisit it later once things stabilized. I read the first page and felt my chest tighten. The language was clinical, impersonal. It spoke about me in the third person. It transferred decision-making authority out of my hands without ever saying the word control. I looked at my mother. She didn't meet my eyes. That was the moment something inside me broke cleanly. Not in a dramatic way, not with tears or anger, just a quiet snapping of the last thread that held hope in place. She wasn't confused. She wasn't conflicted. She was prepared. When I said I wouldn't sign, the room didn't erupt. No one argued. No one raised their voice. Instead, they nodded, almost with relief. One of them said my refusal was understandable given my state of mind. Another noted it for the record. My refusal wasn't resistance. It was confirmation. They told me I needed rest. They told me it was for my own good. They told me everything would be reviewed later. I was escorted, not guided, out of the room. My phone was taken temporarily. My bag was searched gently, politely, as if this were standard procedure. I kept waiting for someone to ask how I felt. No one did. By the time we reached the car, I was no longer a participant in what was happening. I was an object being moved. My mother spoke softly, apologetically, saying this was hard for her too. She said she hoped one day I'd understand. I didn't answer. I was busy realizing that my name no longer meant what it used to. The place they took me to was clean and quiet and designed to look harmless. The walls were a neutral color. The staff smiled. Everything about it suggested care. That was intentional. It made protest look unreasonable. I was shown to a room and told to settle in. They said we'd talk later. That later stretched into hours, then days. My access to information narrowed. My questions were redirected. My requests were delayed. When I asked to call my mother, they told me she was busy. When I asked to call anyone else, they told me it wasn't a good time. I remember the exact moment I realized I was no longer being heard. I was sitting across from a woman with a clipboard explaining carefully that there had been a misunderstanding. She listened, politely nodded, and then said, "I'll note that you're feeling distressed." That was it. Everything I said after that became a symptom. Days passed in a blur. Schedules appeared without explanation. Rules were implied, not stated. I learned quickly which questions were safe and which ones closed doors. I learned that calm compliance made things smoother, even if it solved nothing. My mother didn't come. At first I told myself she needed time, that she was processing, that she would arrive any moment and demand clarity. Each day that passed without her felt heavier than the last. Her absence spoke louder than any sentence she could have sent. The world moved on with terrifying efficiency. Decisions were made. Access was revoked. My status changed on paper. I learned this not because anyone explained it, but because the way people spoke to me shifted. There was a finality in their voices. I wasn't a temporary concern anymore. I was a case. Everything was framed as care. Every restriction was justified as protection. My disappearance was sanitized, wrapped in language that made it sound responsible. I understood then why systems like this rarely face resistance. They don't look violent. They look reasonable. At night, I lay awake listening to the hum of the building, replaying the meeting in my head. The glances, the phrasing, my mother's silence. I searched for the moment I could have changed things, the sentence I should have said differently. There wasn't one. This hadn't happened because I made a mistake. It happened because the process was designed to work this way. Once initiated, it fed on compliance and punished clarity. The more I tried to assert myself, the more it documented me as unstable. Weeks later, I was referred to by a classification instead of my name. The sound of it landed like a physical blow. I realized then that identity isn't just who you believe yourself to be. It's who the system agrees to recognize. And the system had erased me. I stopped expecting rescue after that, not because I gave up, but because hope in a place like that is a liability. It keeps you waiting for permission that will never come. What I didn't know then was how permanent this erasure was meant to be, how carefully it had been planned, how many signatures it took to make a person vanish without leaving a mark. If something had happened to me after that day, it would have been considered resolved, documented, closed. That was the truth they never said out loud. The day I stopped existing wasn't loud or chaotic or cruel in the ways people imagine. It was efficient, polite, final, and it worked exactly the way it was supposed to. Time stopped behaving normally once my name was taken away. Days didn't begin or end so much as blur into one another, stitched together by routines I didn't choose. Lights came on at the same hour. Meals appeared on trays that looked identical no matter what day it was. Conversations followed scripts. No one ever told me how long I would be there. That uncertainty was intentional. It made the mind reach for hope, and hope kept you compliant. The place they put me in wasn't violent. That was the most disorienting part. It was clean controlled and designed to look temporary. Neutral walls, soft voices, doors that locked without making a sound. Everything about it suggested care while removing every choice that mattered. There were no windows I could open, no clocks I could trust. Time was announced to me instead of experienced. When you live like that, days stop having shape. You measure life in meals and check-ins and the hum of the building at night. Control wasn't enforced with force. It was enforced with rules that were never written down. Privileges appeared and disappeared without explanation. If you complied, things were smoother. If you asked questions, schedules changed. Silence was rewarded. Curiosity was documented. I learned quickly which version of myself made life easier for the people watching me. Calm, polite, agreeable. I learned to speak just enough to seem cooperative without giving them anything to use. I learned to keep my face neutral even when my thoughts were racing. At first, I waited for my mother. I counted days the way children do when they expect a parent to return. I imagined her walking through the door, demanding answers, insisting on seeing me. I rehearsed what I would say when she finally showed up. I held on to that image because without it, the reality was unbearable. She didn't come. There were no messages, no inquiries, no requests to see me. When I asked about her, I was told she was busy, that she trusted the professionals, that everything was being handled. Her absence became louder than any accusation. It told me this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a decision. After the first year, something in me hardened, not in a dramatic way. It was more like a quiet settling the moment you realize the door you're knocking on was never connected to the room you're standing in. Waiting stopped making sense. That was when I began to observe. I stopped asking why and started watching how. I paid attention to patterns, shift changes, which staff followed rules rigidly and which bent them out of fatigue, who documented everything and who relied on memory. I noticed how often systems assume compliance once someone stops resisting. I learned when to speak and when to disappear into myself. I learned that stillness can be mistaken for defeat. I let them believe I had accepted my place. There was one person who didn't fully belong to the system. I noticed them months before I understood their significance. They moved differently, carefully. Their eyes lingered too long on locked doors, on clipped conversations. When they handed me something, their fingers shook just slightly. We never spoke openly. There was no dramatic alliance, no whispered plans, just moments of recognition. A look held a second longer than necessary. A question asked too carefully. Fear mirrored fear. That was enough. Years passed. I marked them not by dates but by changes. A new coat of paint, a revised policy, different faces. I was declared stable more than once. The word sounded hopeful until I realized it didn't lead anywhere. Stability became another justification for keeping me exactly where I was. Release, I understood, was never the goal. The longer I stayed, the more invisible I became. My presence faded into routine. People stopped double-checking. They stopped explaining. That's when systems grow careless. That's when mistakes begin. Isolation sharpened my thinking in ways I hadn't expected. Without distractions, every detail mattered. I memorized procedures. I noticed inconsistencies. I tracked who had authority and who simply followed orders. I stored information the way some people store valuables, carefully, quietly, knowing it might save me later. Silence taught me patience. It taught me how to wait without hoping, how to prepare without acting, how to let others underestimate me. There were nights when the weight of it all pressed so hard on my chest I couldn't breathe. Nights when I had to remind myself that surviving didn't require feeling strong, only staying alive. I learned to sit with fear without letting it dictate my actions. Occasionally, someone new would ask me how I was doing, genuinely curious. Those moments were dangerous. Concern invites scrutiny, and scrutiny threatens narratives. I learned to answer in ways that reassured them I was no longer a problem. The system rewarded that. I stopped thinking about escape in terms of running. Running would only prove their story right. Running would make me easy to dismiss. If I was going to leave, it had to be on terms that mattered. I needed leverage. I didn't know what form it would take yet. I only knew that every system leaves traces. Every process creates records. Every decision has a shadow it can't erase. My job was to collect those shadows without being seen. Years into my confinement, I noticed the first real crack. It was small. A schedule shift that wasn't logged properly. A document left visible for half a second longer than it should have been. A name mentioned casually that shouldn't have been mentioned at all. I didn't react. I didn't change my behavior. I stored it away. After that, the cracks came more frequently. Not because the system weakened, but because it assumed I was no longer watching. Complacency is the reward of control. The person I had noticed before, the one who didn't belong, grew more cautious. Their help became more precise. A door unlocked a little earlier than scheduled. Information offered in fragments. We never acknowledged it. That made it safer. I was still careful. One mistake would have meant permanent disappearance, not isolation, not punishment, erasure. I understood that now. They thought silence meant surrender. They were wrong. Stillness had given me something they didn't account for: clarity, perspective, time to understand the machinery that had swallowed me, time to learn where it relied on trust instead of locks. The day I realized I could leave wasn't triumphant. It was terrifying. It meant everything I had endured had led to a moment that couldn't be undone. Failure would not mean going back to how things were. It would mean disappearing in a way no one could trace. I waited anyway, because the hardest lesson captivity taught me was this: systems fall, not when someone fights them head-on, but when they believe the person they broke has nothing left to do but comply. I was very good at looking broken. By the time they noticed something was wrong, it would already be too late to fix quietly. And that was the mistake they never saw coming. Systems don't collapse because someone fights them. They collapse because someone notices the small things no one thinks to protect. By the time the first crack appeared, I had been compliant for so long that no one looked at me closely anymore. I had become part of the background, like the walls or the schedules pinned behind glass. Managed, stable, safe. That word followed me everywhere, as if it explained my continued existence. The change was almost laughably small. One morning, a routine I knew by heart shifted. A check-in happened 10 minutes late. Not enough to raise concern, not enough to document. Just enough to matter. I didn't react. I didn't ask questions. I didn't even look up right away. I let the moment pass as if it meant nothing. but I felt it, like a hairline fracture under your fingers. After that, I paid closer attention. Not obviously, quietly. I watched how delays affected other steps in the day. I noted which people apologized and which didn't notice the change at all. I listened to how explanations grew looser when they thought no one was listening. I learned more by saying nothing than I ever had by speaking. Silence makes people uncomfortable. They fill it with information without realizing they're doing it. They repeat themselves. They simplify. They get careless. I sat across from them, calm and agreeable, and let them talk. One person in particular began to slip. Not maliciously, not dramatically, just tired, overworked, human. Their routines became predictable. Their guard lowered in small, cumulative ways. The system depended on their consistency, and consistency is fragile when it's carried by one exhausted body. I memorized patterns the way other people memorize prayers. The first piece of information I was never supposed to have came to me by accident. A name spoken casually in conversation between two people who assumed I wasn't paying attention. It was dropped like a stone into still water, creating ripples I pretended not to see. I understood immediately what it meant. I didn't react. That was the hardest part. Every instinct screamed to ask questions, to confirm, to grab hold of it before it slipped away. Instead, I stayed still. I let them believe the name meant nothing to me, that I hadn't noticed. Later alone, I turned it over in my mind until it fit into place. Once you see the shape of a system, you can't unsee it. Everything aligns differently. Every action has a motive. Every delay has a reason. I began to see not just what they were doing, but why. They weren't just containing me. They were protecting themselves. The doubts came back after that. Quiet at first, then louder. Doubts about my own judgment. Doubts about whether I was imagining patterns that weren't there. Doubts about whether patience had finally turned into paralysis. I used those doubts the way I'd learned to use everything else. Carefully. I let myself appear weaker, more resigned. I reinforced their assumptions. I stopped asking for things entirely. I followed instructions without hesitation. I thanked them. I apologized when I didn't need to. Trust loosened further. The person who didn't belong to the system noticed the shift before anyone else. Our brief moments of eye contact grew longer. Assistance came a little too precisely to be coincidence. A door unlocked at the exact minute it needed to. A document lingered where I could see the heading before it disappeared. We never acknowledged it. That was the rule we never spoke aloud. Recognition was enough. Anything more would have been dangerous. The final piece came weeks later. Another small error. Another detail revealed by carelessness. When it landed, everything clicked into place so cleanly, it took my breath away. I knew then that escape was possible. Not easy, not safe. Possible, but only once. Failure wouldn't mean punishment. It wouldn't mean stricter rules or longer confinement. It would mean disappearance. A correction so thorough, no one would ever question it. The system would close ranks, and I would be a footnote if that. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was afraid, but because I was calculating. Timing mattered more than courage. Acting too soon would expose me. Acting too late would cost me the opportunity entirely. I waited. Waiting didn't feel like surrender anymore. It felt like a loaded spring held in place by discipline alone. Every day I delayed strengthened my position and weakened theirs. I thought about my mother during those hours, not with anger, but with clarity. I wondered whether she believed this system would hold forever, whether she told herself I was safe, or whether she preferred not to think about me at all. I wondered if she had any idea how fragile the structure she relied on truly was. By morning, my decision was set. I wasn't waiting to survive anymore. I was waiting to move. The system continued its routines, unaware that it had already lost its advantage. It trusted its labels and its paperwork. It trusted that silence meant acceptance. It trusted that time erodes resistance. They never considered that time could sharpen it instead. When the moment finally came, it wasn't dramatic. No alarms, no raised voices, just a sequence of actions unfolding exactly as I'd predicted, each one dependent on the last, each one assuming I was still where they'd left me. I moved without panic. Panic draws attention. I moved the way I'd learned to live there, calmly, precisely, as if I belonged. The door that mattered opened when it was supposed to. The corridor was empty because it always was at that hour. The name I'd overheard weeks earlier unlocked a response that should never have been available to me. I didn't hesitate. As I crossed the threshold, I understood something with startling clarity. The hardest part of captivity hadn't been the confinement. It had been convincing myself that waiting was the same as being powerless. It wasn't. Power doesn't announce itself. It accumulates quietly in observation and restraint and timing. It waits until the moment when the people who think they control everything stop looking. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, the question wouldn't be how I got out. It would be how they'd ever believed I wouldn't try. I didn't look back as I took my first unsupervised steps, not because I was brave, but because looking back belonged to a version of me they thought they'd erased. That person was gone. What came next would prove just how expensive that assumption was. Escape doesn't feel like victory when you understand what's still hunting you. The moment I stepped outside, the air felt too wide, too loud. Sounds collided instead of lining up neatly the way they had inside. Cars passed, voices overlapped. The world moved without asking permission. I stood there for a second longer than I should have, forcing myself not to look like someone who had just learned how big the sky was again. Running was the instinct. Every part of me screamed to disappear, to put distance between myself and everything that had tried to erase me. Change my name, leave the state, let the system explain my absence however it wanted. I didn't do that. If I ran, I would become exactly what they needed me to be, a problem that solved itself. A story that could be closed with a shrug and a line in a file. Freedom without proof would still make me disposable. I needed leverage, not distance. I moved carefully, sticking to places where I blended in without effort. I had memorized how to look unremarkable. Years of containment teach you that skill whether you want it or not. I used public transportation, avoided cameras when I could, stayed where my presence wouldn't register as unusual. The window they left open wasn't dramatic. It never is. It was a convergence of assumptions, a staff shortage, a delayed update, a belief that the person they'd broken had nothing left to do but exist quietly. They had confused compliance with surrender. I knew this chance wouldn't repeat itself. The system would correct the mistake once it realized it had made one. I didn't have the luxury of hesitation. Acting now was dangerous. Waiting was fatal. I made the decision the way I'd learned to make all important choices there, calmly, without ceremony. I acknowledged the cost of failure and accepted it. Once I did that, fear lost some of its grip. Getting out hadn't required force. It had required preparation and timing. I didn't break anything. I didn't leave chaos behind. Chaos invites scrutiny. I moved through the spaces I'd studied for years, stepping into gaps created by habit and exhaustion. When I finally crossed the last threshold, the door didn't slam shut behind me. It clicked softly, almost politely like it always had. That sound followed me longer than I expected. The first breath of unsupervised air didn't bring relief. It brought alertness. Every sense sharpened at once. Light felt too bright. Sounds felt layered. My body was free, but my mind was still measuring exits and angles. I kept moving. The urge to contact someone immediately was strong, but I resisted it. Reaching out too soon would leave a trail before I understood where I stood. I needed to know what they were doing before I let them know what I was doing. I found a place to sit where no one would notice me. I watched people pass and tried to remember how to exist without permission. My hands shook when I finally pulled out the phone I'd acquired, my fingers stiff from disuse. I didn't call my mother. Not yet. The first person I contacted was someone with institutional weight, someone whose job was to notice patterns that didn't add up. I kept my message brief and factual. I didn't beg. I didn't dramatize. I stated who I was, where I had been, and that my continued absence posed a legal risk they should care about. The response came faster than I expected. They already knew something was wrong. Not enough to act on, not enough to challenge a system built on paperwork and authority. But my existence outside it changed the equation. Proof has a way of doing that. While I waited for next steps, I began learning what had happened in my absence. Reports filed the moment I was discovered missing. Narratives activated with impressive speed. I saw the language they used to frame my disappearance as instability rather than escape. My mother's involvement became clearer with each update. She hadn't been passive. She had been efficient. The system she relied on responded exactly as it was designed to when control was threatened. Panic replaced silence. I understood then that I wasn't safe just because I was free. Legal systems move faster than people realize, and once they align, they're difficult to stop. If I hesitated now, if I let them define the next step, my freedom would be temporary. I was no longer contained. I was pursued. That realization sharpened everything. Fear became focused instead of diffuse. I began working with people who understood procedure and timing better than emotion. They told me what I already suspected. My story would only matter if it entered the system cleanly. Hearsay wouldn't be enough. Outrage wouldn't be enough. Documentation would. Each conversation confirmed how narrowly I had slipped through. The process designed to erase me had left its fingerprints everywhere. The same precision that made it effective made it traceable. My phone buzzed with new messages, numbers I didn't recognize, a voicemail that cut off before the speaker finished introducing themselves. I didn't respond. I wasn't ready to let my voice be used yet. The confrontation I'd been avoiding began to feel inevitable. I thought about my mother often during those hours, but not the way I used to. Not with longing or confusion. With analysis. I replayed her silences, her phrasing the way she'd leaned into professional language when it suited her. I wondered whether she believed she had closed this chapter permanently. If she did, she was about to learn how expensive that assumption was. By nightfall, I understood that escape had never been the plan. It had been the opening move, the first visible proof that the story they'd built couldn't contain me anymore. What came next would require patience of a different kind. Not the passive patience of waiting, but the active patience of letting someone else make the next mistake. I drafted messages I didn't send. I planned conversations I wouldn't have yet. Timing mattered more than confrontation. Letting them reveal themselves mattered more than forcing anything into the open. When I finally lay down, exhaustion hit me all at once. My body shook with it. Freedom is heavy when you're carrying years of control out with you. Before sleep took me, I made one decision that felt final in a way nothing else had yet. I would not disappear again, not quietly, not politely, not for anyone's convenience. The next time my mother heard from me, it wouldn't be through intermediaries or paperwork or carefully worded updates. It would be directly, and it would make it impossible for her to pretend I had ever been just a problem she solved by forgetting. Escape had only opened the door. The confrontation waiting on the other side would decide everything else. I avoided her longer than I avoided anyone else. I spoke to lawyers, investigators, people whose job it was to pull apart systems and lay them bare. I answered questions calmly. I followed instructions. I learned how close I still was to being erased again if I made the wrong move. But every time someone asked whether I'd spoken to my mother yet, my chest tightened in a way nothing else triggered. Facing her felt more dangerous than captivity. The place that held me had rules, predictable ones. She didn't. The confrontation didn't happen in a dramatic way. There was no storming into rooms or shouting across tables. That would have given her control. I agreed to contact under conditions I chose, recorded, witnessed, structured. She didn't like that, but she agreed anyway. I think part of her still believed she could talk her way out of anything. When her face appeared on the screen, my first instinct was to search for signs of relief. Fear, guilt, anything that suggested she understood what had happened. There was nothing. She looked irritated, tired, as if this was an inconvenience she'd hoped would resolve itself quietly. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't ask where I'd been. She went straight to questioning the legality of my escape, the disruption it caused, the trouble it was creating. "You didn't think about the consequences," she said, her voice clipped and controlled. "You've made things very complicated." I listened without interrupting. That unsettled her more than anger would have. She spoke about concern and care about how hard the last years had been for her. She said she'd done everything she could to protect me, that professionals had advised her that I didn't understand how unstable I'd been at the time. She said it calmly, confidently, like she'd rehearsed it. I asked her one question. I asked why she had never come to see me. She paused just for a moment. Then she said she trusted the process, that it was better for everyone if things were handled properly, that visits would have been upsetting, for who she didn't say. As she spoke, I realized something that should have been obvious sooner. She wasn't lying to me. She was telling a version of the truth that made her actions feel necessary. That made my disappearance feel like care instead of control. She wasn't ashamed. She was convinced. When I challenged specific details, dates, signatures, decisions made without my consent, she deflected smoothly. She reframed. She minimized. She spoke about my reactions instead of her actions. Every time I pressed, she shifted the ground beneath the conversation. "You were always sensitive," she said at one point, as if it explained everything. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I let her talk. The sentence came out of her when she grew tired of explaining herself. "You're just a mistake of my past. I want to forget." She didn't shout it. She didn't whisper it either. She said it plainly, as if naming an object she no longer needed. The words hung between us, heavy and unmistakable. For a second I couldn't hear anything else. Not the room, not the breathing of the people listening in. Just that sentence, sharp and final. In that moment, something inside me settled completely. I understood then that I had been chasing the wrong thing my entire life. I wasn't waiting for an apology or an explanation. I was waiting for confirmation. And she had just given it to me. She didn't see me as a daughter who'd been hurt. She saw me as an error she'd corrected imperfectly. I didn't respond right away. Silence stretched. She shifted, uncomfortable now, perhaps realizing she'd said something she couldn't take back. I said nothing. That silence gave her room to believe she'd won. She straightened her confidence, returning. She began outlining what would happen next. Legal steps, statements, the importance of controlling the narrative. She spoke as if my presence was a temporary disruption, something that would soon be managed again. She underestimated what that sentence had done. After the call ended, I sat very still. Not because I was frozen, but because I was clear. The confusion that had haunted me for years vanished. There would be no reconciliation, no understanding, no shared reality. There would only be consequences. Within days, she moved quickly, just as I'd expected. Papers filed, assets shifted, conversations initiated behind closed doors. She tried to discredit me before I could speak, framing my return as instability, my escape as proof of unreliability. It confirmed everything. The people working with me watched it unfold with professional detachment. They told me this was good, that overreach always reveals more than restraint, that the fastest way to expose intent is to give someone just enough rope. I let her believe I was rattled. I delayed responses. I asked questions I didn't need answered. I allowed her to think her strategy was working. Inside, I was already done trying to be understood. The game had changed. It was no longer about proving I had been wronged. It was about narrative. Whoever controlled the story controlled reality. And she had grown careless in her certainty. Each move she made left a trail. Each attempt to silence me created documentation she couldn't erase. The more aggressively she acted, the clearer her intent became. I realized then why the sentence she'd spoken mattered so much. Not because it hurt, but because it revealed her mindset completely. It explained the years of silence, the ease with which she'd let others decide my fate, the absence of guilt. Mistakes aren't mourned, they're corrected. By the end of that week, I understood the game in full, not just the rules, but the rhythm. I knew when she would push and when she would pause. I knew which allies she would lean on and which would quietly step back when things grew uncomfortable. She believed this was a battle of authority. It wasn't. It was a battle of timing. I had something she didn't realize yet. Not just evidence, not just witnesses. I had patience sharpened by years of waiting, and I had a system finally willing to listen because it could no longer deny I existed. I drafted the message I would send her and saved it without sending. I read it once, then closed the file. It wasn't time. The next step wouldn't be emotional. It wouldn't be private. And it wouldn't be something she could explain away with calm language and practiced concern. The next step would make forgetting me impossible, and when it happened, it would be too late for her to pretend that sentence had been a moment of frustration instead of a confession. She had finally said out loud what she'd been acting on for years. All that remained was to make sure the world heard what followed. Revenge doesn't scream. It waits until the other side is convinced nothing is coming. By the time my mother realized I wasn't collapsing the way she expected, everything was already in motion. I didn't announce what I was doing. I didn't threaten. I let her believe her version of events was working, that her filings and statements were creating the doubt she needed. Silence used correctly makes people reckless. I had leverage she didn't know existed yet, not stolen, not fabricated. Every piece of it had been created by her own decisions. Documents she signed without thinking anyone would read them carefully. Emails sent under the assumption of loyalty. Timelines that contradicted one another just enough to matter. None of it would have meant anything on its own. Together it formed a pattern she couldn't explain away. I let her continue. She filed motions framed as protective measures. She contacted people I hadn't spoken to in years, planting careful seeds of doubt. She positioned herself as the reasonable party forced to manage an unfortunate situation. I didn't challenge any of it publicly. I didn't respond right away. I allowed the narrative to expand just enough to stretch thin. That was the mistake I was waiting for. The moment came when she tried to move something she shouldn't have touched, an asset she assumed was already out of my reach. The action was quiet, procedural, and devastating to her case. It exposed a contradiction she couldn't reconcile. I didn't confront her directly. That would have been too obvious. Instead, I went after the structure supporting her confidence, the professionals who had shielded her decisions, the institutions that assumed her authority was legitimate. Questions were raised formally and quietly. Compliance departments were notified. Reviews initiated. No accusations, just requests for clarification that couldn't be ignored. The system responded the way it always does when uncertainty enters. Slowly at first, then all at once. My mother felt it before she understood it. Calls stopped being returned as quickly. Meetings were postponed. Conversations ended with promises instead of assurances. She reached out to me, her tone shifting from authority to irritation. She asked what I was doing. I answered honestly, nothing I said. And that was true. The pressure built without my involvement. The people she relied on began distancing themselves, not out of loyalty to me, but out of self-preservation. Paper trails are dangerous things once someone decides to follow them to the end. I introduced the second move carefully, not a confrontation, but a provocation designed to force her hand. I let her believe she had discovered something damaging. I let her act on that belief. She did exactly what I expected. Her response created evidence she couldn't erase. Emails sent in haste. Decisions made without consultation. Statements that contradicted previous filings. Watching it unfold felt surreal, not triumphant, precise, like observing a machine finally jam because it was pushed past its design. There was a moment when I could have destroyed everything completely, exposed every detail, pushed for maximum damage. I considered it. The thought passed through me like a cold current. I chose otherwise. Justice isn't about annihilation. It's about truth reaching the place where denial used to live. The turning point came quietly. A formal notice, a request for records, an inquiry she couldn't dismiss as harassment or misunderstanding. For the first time, she wasn't directing the process. She was responding to it. When she realized the tables had turned, it showed in the smallest ways. Her voice tightened. Her phrasing changed. She stopped speaking in absolutes. She reached out again this time, carefully, almost cautiously. She asked if there was a way to resolve things privately. The word privately landed with more weight than she intended. I didn't answer right away. The consequences didn't arrive in one dramatic blow. They arrived in layers. Access restricted, authority questioned, assumptions challenged. Each step eroded the certainty she'd built her life on. She was no longer untouchable. I watched from a distance, not hiding, but not interfering. The truth doesn't need encouragement once it's given room to breathe. It expands on its own. By the end of that week, she understood she had misjudged me completely. Not because I was clever or ruthless, but because I was patient. Because I had learned to wait without losing sight of the moment that mattered. This was only the opening act. The public still didn't know everything. They didn't know how carefully my disappearance had been arranged, how many people had signed off without asking the right questions, how easily a person could be erased if the paperwork was clean. That part was coming. I reviewed the final materials late one night alone, timelines aligned, statements matched. The story was no longer mine to tell alone. It would be read aloud, entered into record, spoken by people whose voices carried weight whether they wanted them to or not. When I closed the file, I felt something I hadn't expected. Peace, not satisfaction, not vengeance, just the quiet certainty that whatever happened next, the outcome would be decided by facts, not fear. My mother had believed this was a contest of control. That authority alone would protect her. She never considered that the system she trusted could turn its attention toward her instead. By the time the truth surfaced publicly, she would understand what it meant to be powerless inside a process she could no longer direct. And when that moment came, it wouldn't matter what she said. The record would speak for itself. All that remained was to let it. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the recording devices. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and paper, the kind of sterile scent that tries to convince you it's neutral. But there was nothing neutral about what was about to happen. I sat there quietly letting the proceedings unfold as the truth prepared to speak louder than anyone's objections could. Documents were passed across the table in neat stacks, each one carefully highlighted. Every signature, every date, every annotation aligned into a timeline that could not be refuted. I watched as the professionals read aloud, their voices calm and measured, yet carrying the weight of evidence that had been waiting years to be presented. Each line built on the last, creating a narrative that was undeniable. I did not interrupt. I did not comment. My mother's eyes flicked toward me once, and in that brief glance I saw panic she could not mask. She tried to maintain composure, to nod and adjust her posture to remind herself and everyone else that she had been the one in control all these years. But the documents didn't lie, and her control had cracks that could no longer be covered. The first contradiction came from a single, seemingly small memo, one she had assumed would never be seen by anyone outside her trusted circle. It documented decisions made in her absence, or rather decisions she had delegated without oversight, assuming I was too powerless to notice. Reading it aloud in the room with witnesses and recordings capturing every word was the first domino. As the memo's contents sank in, her hands trembled slightly. She reached for a pen, perhaps to correct something, perhaps to assert authority, but it was too late. Every move she made from that point became part of the record. Every attempt to explain, to shift blame, to reframe her actions fell flat against the concrete evidence before her. Witnesses were called people whose statements had been gathered meticulously over the months. Each one confirmed the same pattern actions she had taken, instructions she had given, moments where she assumed her decisions were invisible, and moments when she deliberately silenced others. The room didn't need drama. The truth itself was its own spectacle. I listened as she attempted one final defense. Calm, rational, almost rehearsed. She claimed misunderstanding. She claimed overzealous care. She claimed she had only ever acted in my best interest. But the facts, the timelines, the records, the corroborated accounts spoke louder than any assertion she could make. For the first time, I heard her voice falter just slightly. It was a micro-expression, almost invisible if you weren't looking closely. But I was looking. I had been trained to notice these things over 9 years of careful observation. That falter told me everything I needed to know. She was aware in that instant that she could no longer rewrite the story she had tried to control for decades. And then came the moment I had been waiting for. My existence, previously questioned, dismissed, and erased on paper, was now acknowledged publicly, formally, and irrevocably. My name was spoken clearly. My role, my experience, and the truth of what had happened to me were recorded. The room acknowledged it. There was no disputing it. Not legally, not socially, not morally. Her attempts at manipulation had failed. Her carefully constructed narrative had collapsed under its own weight. She had counted on authority, routine, and complacency to maintain her version of reality. I had counted on patience, observation, and timing, and I had won not by force, but by understanding the structure that sought to erase me. In that quiet room, I allowed myself a moment to breathe. Not because the ordeal was over. I knew there were still procedural steps, still people who might question the outcome, but because the central truth had been made undeniable. I existed. I mattered. My experience could not be rewritten. She tried one last gambit, appealing to sympathy, trying to remind the room that she had been misunderstood. But the appeal fell flat. Evidence had weight. Sympathy without foundation has none. Each attempt to pivot to insert doubt only further confirmed the reality everyone could see. By the time the session ended, the consequences had begun to set in. Legal authority, financial oversight, and reputational accountability had shifted. The system that she had assumed would protect her had been used against her, not through rage but through reason. My mother realized it, though she wouldn't admit it aloud. She had miscalculated entirely. As I left the room, I didn't smile. There was no triumph in my expression, no gloating. That wasn't the point. The point was clarity. Justice doesn't need fanfare. It needs fact. It needs procedure. And today it had arrived. Walking through the halls after the final statements were recorded, I felt a strange mixture of relief and exhaustion. Relief that the truth was undeniable. Exhaustion from the years it had taken to reach this point. The fight hadn't been physical, it hadn't been violent, but it had been total, consuming every careful thought, every silent observation, every patience-tested decision I had made since my disappearance. For the first time in years, I felt like the next step was mine to choose. My freedom was no longer theoretical, it was official. And now, for the first time, I could consider what it meant to live outside the shadow of control, manipulation, and attempted erasure. The consequences for her were set. Legal, social, and moral accountability had found their place. But what mattered more than her punishment was the restoration of my own identity, my voice, my existence, in a world that had pretended I didn't matter. And while the record had spoken, while the truth was now undeniable, I knew there was one more choice to make. What I would do with that freedom, how I would shape the life that followed, was entirely mine. Silence settled over the house differently now. The doors were open, the papers were signed, the truth had been recorded. The people who had tried to erase me had been confronted not with anger, but with facts. And in that stillness, I felt the weight of the years finally begin to lift. Justice doesn't come with fireworks. It comes quietly. It comes in the recognition that your life matters, that your voice exists, and that no amount of manipulation or planning can erase you if the record is clear and witnesses exist. I felt that quiet as I sat in my own apartment for the first time, without someone watching, without someone always waiting for a misstep, without the constant calculation that had consumed my days. The freedom I now had wasn't just about being outside the house or beyond her reach. It was about reclaiming myself. Every choice I made now belonged to me. Every moment could be directed by my own intention, not by someone else's schedule assessment or idea of what was safe. I thought about my mother, not with anger, not with desire for revenge. I thought about her the way you consider someone who never understood the world the way you needed them to. She had made her choices, and I had made mine. There was no reconciliation here. There was no need. The lessons had been learned, the boundaries had been enforced, and the truth had been acknowledged. I looked at my life now, the one I could build from this point. I decided which parts of the past would define me and which would remain as evidence of resilience. My name, my history, my experiences, all of them were mine to carry in whatever form I chose. No longer a footnote in someone else's narrative, I had full ownership of myself. Some mornings I wake up and feel the weight of what was stolen, what could have been lost forever. But then I remember the sequence of small, deliberate steps that led me here. The patience, the observation, the moments of silence that had allowed me to act with precision when the opportunity came. Those years of waiting weren't wasted, they were preparation. I am careful now, as I should be. I protect myself with boundaries. I choose who enters my life. I choose what I share and how. and I make sure that the people who claim authority over me cannot redefine who I am without my consent. The world outside my window is ordinary and chaotic, bright and uncontained, and that strangely is comforting. There are no plans to monitor me, no reports being filed in my absence, no silent judgment waiting for me in a corner. I exist freely, I speak freely, I move freely. For anyone watching, anyone who has ever felt invisible in a household, in a family, in a system meant to protect you, there is one lesson: your identity is yours. It cannot be erased by silence or documents or careful planning. The world may try to write over you, but the truth once recognized and asserted cannot be buried. If this story resonates with you, take a moment to reflect on your own life. Have you allowed yourself to be minimized? Have you waited for others to define your worth? Comment below. Share your experience. Your voice matters, and so does the record of your existence. If you found this story meaningful, give it a like. Subscribe to the channel for more stories about justice, resilience, and the quiet power that comes from reclaiming your life. These are stories not just to be heard, but to remind us that control can be challenged, boundaries can be set, and truth always finds a way to speak. I was never a mistake. I was simply inconvenient to someone who wanted control, and now I am nothing but undeniable,